So my work really began with a question about space. What is it? What is it made of? What is the structure and substance of space? And how does space shape everything that we experience around us? Most of my work is about trying to visualize empty space as well as thinking about light and gravity and other forces like that. I sort of consider those forces to be almost like materials that I use. So like instead of paint, I think about using gravity or light. But of course, I also use other materials, like normal art materials as well. This is called Reflective Mimicry. It's a really early piece, and it's kind of the thing that I think of as like my first real work. So I was making a lot of work before this time. This is around 1994. I was thinking about what makes something solid, and why do we think of things as solid when nothing is actually solid. Atoms are mostly space, the atoms that make up any object. And so then I was thinking about like, where does that boundary happen between like what we think of as solid and what we think of as space? And so I made this suit that I would wear at first, covered in mirrors, to kind of like dissolve the boundary between my body and the space around it. And I was thinking of like sort of creating almost like an optical continuum between like the edges of my body and the space. In the end, I didn't wear I didn't wear the suit. I ended up having somebody else wear the suit, and then I took the pictures, but the idea was the same. And then I also made these like kind of extensions that went off the back of the suit and off the fingers, which you can't see right now, just to kind of like make that boundary even more diffuse. Then a few years later, still thinking about that topic, I had made a bunch of work in between again. I made this piece called Mirror Fence, which is at Storm King. It's in the permanent collection of Storm King in New York. You can kind of see it's that line. It's a little bit invisible, which is intentional. And it's a white picket fence, but it's all mirrored, clearly. And this actually happened because somebody put me in a show. I don't remember what the title of that show was. It was some show about the American dream, or suburbia. It was about suburbia. And I thought suburbia, the American dream, the white picket fence. And I had been working with mirrors already, and I thought about making a mirrored picket fence in the landscape. And being a big fan of nature, I was very hesitant to make any kind of sculpture outdoors, really concerned about ruining the outdoors rather than adding to the outdoors. So this seemed like some way of kind of like integrating the outdoors to the sculpture. In any case, so it's also about taking, it's the same thing about space. So there's the pickets and there's the space between the pickets, and those kind of, as you're walking by it, they really switch. And so there's like a kind of figure ground back and forth, which is really interesting. And like the space seems like a solid and the solid seems like a space, and it kind of flickers as you go by it. It's about 150 feet long. That was another thing that, I made that that's a whole other side story, but I didn't really realize how much work that would be. And the other thing that's really important in my work, and you can see in the work outside as well, is that it changes with the light. And I was really interested, I think at that time maybe people were making work that was like video oriented. Of course people are still making videos, but I like the idea of change in the work, but I wanted it to happen naturally. I didn't want to have a machine that I would have to fix or whatever. And so the mirror also allows that, and you can see here, that's obviously in the spring, and this is in the fall. This is actually a refurbished version of the fence, which is even better than the previous one. And that's it. I don't have any great pictures in the snow, but you get an idea. Then very recently, so I'm going to skip around in time. This is a pretty recent piece called Break Line. And So a really common theme in my work is that years will go by until I can figure out how to like do the next iteration of, what I've done. And in the meantime, I make a lot of other stuff, but I wanted to make another mirror fence, and I couldn't figure out, how to go beyond what I'd done before, and I wanted to curve it, but I didn't want to curve it in a very boring, curvy way. So what I did was, and this is for a private collection, I drew a line on the landscape with a rope, and then I took a snow fence, those that have like the wood things connected to the wires. I don't know if they have them here. But we took a real one, we brought it onto the landscape, and we let it sort of respond to the landscape, and then we recorded every single picket, like where it was in relationship to a line, and then we made that into a 3D model. So basically what you're seeing is like a real response to the landscape and to the gravity, to the, where it like falls down here, there's like a hill over here, where it's going up over there. So it has a really natural flow versus some of the other approaches I had tried. And I also see it as kind of related to like a wave, breaking wave. And this one, I'm just showing some pictures in the changing light. Maybe I should move faster. I really liked it in the dark as well. Oh, this is a video. Sound of this. Okay. This piece is called Scatter and Screen. It's now at Crystal Bridges, which is vaguely close to here. This is another one. You can see its relationship in a way to the first piece that I showed, but this is really recent as well. I was thinking about how to make a sculpture that would be like, I've worked a lot making large-scale sculptures that are not typical large-scale sculptures, so they're not like steel or, welded. This one is made of lots of little circles that are all almost like sewn together with wire. And so it's sort of like thinking about large-scale sculpture in a new way, large-scale metal sculpture in a new way, and almost even like outdoor monumental sculpture. And so there's an aspect of this which is about all the other stuff that I talked about light. I sort of think of this one as almost like seeing air. But then there's also an aspect of this that I think of as being like a very feminist kind of statement about how to make things. And this just took me and my assistants a bunch of time while we wired every single little circle together. But I like that process, and I like the whole aspect of almost like a sewing circle. The other thing about this that's really different from most metal sculptures is that it's permeable, light goes through it in some of those spaces, so it's not like a solid welded metal object. And this, of course, also changes with the light and changes all the time. This is an older work called The Shape of Space. It's at the Guggenheim, and the Guggenheim owns that one. And you can see the relationship between these various things, but this was like 2004, and the other one was just a couple of years ago. And, so there's been a sort of through line. This piece is made out of lenses, like plastic Fresnel lenses. And they're the kind of lenses that, I don't know if people have seen them, but it used to be that you could go to a drugstore and buy these lenses to read the newspaper with. There's like a square plastic lens. I always loved those, and I love lenses in general. And so I finally, figured out a way to buy them in mass quantities And so they're flexible. So it looks very solid, but it's actually like, paper thin. And they're flexible lenses, and I cut them and stapled them together. So that's what you're seeing here. And that's looking out the other way. But it's called The Shape of Space, and it was inspired by, I was doing a lot of reading about space and how many dimensions space may have, and I wanted to sort of envision what 11 dimensions of space may look like, which was what string theory was talking about at that time. But this one also, I don't have any more slides of that. But this one also changes with the light and changes with, distance. That's another thing that's really important in my work, is that at different distances, there's a different experience that you have. This was a show in Tokyo that I had a number of years ago, and the lens piece is called Geometry of Light. And so this is the same type of lenses as flat lenses cut up. And I was thinking in this piece about light as a particle and as a wave, and seeing light stopped in time. So it's almost like all the little lenses are like little particles of light. At the same time, the sculpture captures light and is almost like an instrument to capture light and watch light. And you can sort of sit there, or at the time it was up, you could, and watch the light change. And it just made it really clear when the light was changing, whereas that's something that, we don't notice in normal life, we don't notice that much. But it became very apparent in this sculpture. I also saw it as kind of like a cloud, or like a bunch of raindrops making up a cloud. So I said this was in Japan, I think, right? So the other thing that was interesting about it was just that the people in Japan, I think, really understood it, which was nice. And they had these little cushions that they set up in the gallery. And people would sit there, apparently, and really watch it. So that was nice. And they would stay and come back. I wasn't sure if people would do that here. And so you can see how different it appears, day versus night. And this is a little time lapse. Also, those shadows really became almost like another kind of clock, where you could almost tell the time by the shadows in the room. We painted the floor white so that the shadows would become really strong. But I got really interested in that idea of, like, telling time by the earth, which is, used to be very common. Let's see, I don't have a very good transition, but in any case, at one point I got interested in making sculptures that would expand from, here's the transition. Thinking about the universe, thinking about space, and I was thinking about how space started as this very, that's what people think. It was this very dense, small, maybe dot, like, almost like a neutron star or something, just really, really small and dense, and it has since been expanding and expanding. So I wanted to make a sculpture that would expand, and I worked on that for a while. And then I started to make these pieces. These are made out of glass beads and wire. And I wanted to show this to just see how it starts, to show you how it starts. And then I put them together. This is how they get raised, and they become these really big, that's like 25 feet high. So it's an expanding sculpture that packs down really flat. It's also good for storage. But that idea of expansion is really interesting to me. And the other thing that was interesting about the sculpture, or these series of sculptures, was, this was huge, but if you touched one little part of it, the whole rest of it would respond. So it actually ends up that there's like a parallel to that in space, or who knows, in the whole universe. but with gravity waves. And so then recently when gravity waves were proven, this is it from the side. This is a very hard sculpture to photograph because it's so delicate. You know, it's just all these little tube beads and they're glass, and just to go on with that for a little bit. And then also the way the light hits it, parts of it will just sort of disappear. So it's always kind of ever changing, and sometimes seems like nothing and sometimes seems like a lot. And I like that aspect of it. Anyway, so to get back to the gravity waves, I have a little animation. Oh, I don't know, maybe it's farther down in the thing, but the gravity waves act the same way, where like a wave will just wave through the universe for eons. This was at the Brooklyn Museum. This is the one that looks a lot like weirdly like the New York Times animation. Here it is. So this was in the Times, like on the day that they discovered. And strangely, with my sculpture, it doesn't squeeze like that much like this does, but it really does have a kind of similar structure. So I thought that was so interesting, and I thought it was interesting that I feel that in art there's a way to discover things in the same way as people discover things in science, and there's a parallel. And actually recently I was reading something about science. It was an essay from the 30s, and it was calling scientists artists, like the best scientists are artists, because they're really just working on things they're curious about, and they discover things. They may or may not be useful. They usually end up being useful many years later, but I think we work in a really similar way. And so I thought it was so strange that like I had been thinking about the universe and, you know, just how to show space. So a lot of the stuff, you know, like my sculptures, these are really like how do you define space? Like I'm making like a container for it so that you can see it. Yeah, so anyway, and then I ended up, you know, making something that was kind of similar to the gravity. I mean, I'm sure gravity waves don't look anything like that animation, but it was interesting. Oh, this is another video. Just because these sculptures are so hard to see in photos, so this is a short. But actually, I mentioned something there that I was going to say she mentioned. She had a good point. Just creating a lot of volume without a lot of mass. That's a really important thing to me, and I think you can see that in all the different sculptures, and it sort of relates back to what I was saying at the beginning about like some of the sculpture that I grew up with was these like, massive steel sculptures, and I really like those. As I don't have anything against those. but I'm just trying to make sculpture in a different way. So this is another piece. This was the one that was at SF MoMA and actually is in their collection. And this was another just, attempt to kind of describe space through lines. Both of those pieces in a way describe space in almost in a drawing sculpture way. This is also the same beads, but this is an earlier piece. And so here the beads are just kind of like pushing up against the floor, and between the way the type of wire and the bead and whatever, it creates that like curved shape. Same with that other piece, the structure that I created is really what the material and the structure I created creates that shape. So I'm always kind of interested in like having things create their shape through gravity, through the materiality of the thing I'm working with. These are wall drawings that I make with thread. They're very hard to see in these photos, but they're thread and pins on the wall, and that's, pretty large, you could see. It started by making drawings, like in a way I didn't really want to make regular drawings, so I thought I would make a drawing through making a shadow. And so I started putting thread on the wall, and then slowly they developed and got more and more complex. I start with making, this is a slightly better photo. I start with making a shape in the computer, and then I take a photograph of that shape and I project it on the wall. And so it goes through all these different like 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional kind of iterations. And then when it's finally on the wall, it becomes somewhere in between 2 and 3 dimensions because it's flat, but it's raised off the wall. It's projecting a shadow onto the wall. It looks like it has a shape. Most people think it has a shape, but it's sort of flat. So I'm interested in that, like where's that dividing line between 2 and 3 dimensions, 3 and 4 dimensions, all that. I'm trying to go a little fast because I think I put too many slides. Here you can see it closer. So when I do those wall drawings, obviously I get a bunch of assistants to help me. These are panel drawings, and these were a little later maybe than that other, or maybe around the same time. But I had done a residency at Stanford, and I had been studying Edward Muybridge's photos, because he did his work there, really, most of his work there. And I always loved those, and I was thinking about this idea of time-lapse, thinking about time. I've always thought about time a lot as well in this stuff, and thinking about how the camera at that time, I mean, this is not like a revelation what I'm saying now, but the camera at that time allowed us to see time in a different way, in a totally new way because of the technology. And I was thinking about how computers in our time let us see time in some other way. I'm not even sure what that way is yet that we're seeing time, but I use the computer a lot for these anyway. And so for these drawings, I would like let something, I guess these are probably a plane fall through space. I would animate the plane. So I'd create a little animation, let the plane fall through space, stop it at various points of time, and then capture those images and make the thread drawing. So there's this combination of technology and handwork together. But then also this kind of strange, unreality really, because there was never a real object. And also kind of a way of like just preserving these moments in time. They start in the same way as the sculpture. So I'll talk about the sculpture later, but just you can think about these later, or just keep them in your head. For those of them close up. And the black ones, this is in the show. I happen to really love that black drawing just because I feel like it's, one of the things, folding, which is the big theme of this show, I got interested in folding because the idea of dimensions of space that I was mentioning before, they're supposedly folded up into themselves, like the other 10 or whatever dimensions that there may or may not be. They are folded, and so then there's all this stuff about folding in space, and that's how I got into space. And this drawing I really think of as like almost seeing folded space because it's so black. This was something, a very early piece I just kind of threw in called My Rug in Hyperbolic Space. My living room rug in hyperbolic space. Yeah, so through that, I was like, what is the shape of the universe? Blah, blah, blah. I had all these kind of big questions. And, I don't even know what the current thinking is, but at that time, the idea was that it was a hyperbolic plane, which is almost like a saddle shape. And so I looked up how to fold paper into a hyperbolic plane, and this was how it was. And then I ended up, actually I did another piece before this, but this was the second version. I was thinking the first version I was trying to just show like a landscape, and it was so big I couldn't really do it. And so I thought, what could be like something understandable and simple and flat? And that's how I ended up with the living room rug. And I took all these pictures of my living room rug, kind of sewed them all together, and then folded them all up like this. So it's the idea of like seeing our regular space in a sort of hyperbolic way. That's a really old piece. These are in the show. This is called Sequent, and I went to Crown Point Press in San Francisco, where they invited me to go. And I was freaking out because I really don't draw. So this is like another theme in my work, and that's why I started the string drawings, because I really don't draw very much. A little. But, I thought, how am I going to make these prints? What am I going to do? There's a lot of pressure. Because actually, you go for like a week and a half, and you got to come up with like a whole thing. And I started just folding paper, and we ran it through the press, and that was interesting. And especially, it made like a little kind of crease in the paper, like a three-dimensional crease. So then that made more sense with my work, being a sculptor, just having a more of a three-dimensionality to it. And what we ended up doing was taking the one on the left is the first one, so I folded the paper once, we inked it up, ran it through the press, then I folded it again, we inked it with a new color, ran it through the press, and so on and so on. So you're seeing like a progression of the piece getting smaller and smaller, and the colors kind of follow on. Although the pink is still there at the end. You can see it just gets more faded. And then the color was also kind of a challenge, because I actually don't really work with color either. But I thought, well, the color, the spectrum, I'll just use the spectrum because I'm interested in light and the spectrum of light. So that's how the color scheme happened. This color scheme, I liked it. There was really no other excuse. So this was another series that I did there, another, larger piece of paper. And I wanted to work more with a gradient. And this is another folding project, which is in the show, called Lexicon. And this was, I'm going to have to go back to another piece of it. I had tried to I started to work in clay maybe 8 years ago. I can't remember right now exactly when. But I'd been going to Japan, saw that picture in Tokyo, and I'd done a bunch of projects in Japan, and I really got interested in ceramics in Japan. And I started to think, well, I could make some origami folded things in clay. But at the time when I tried to make it, I couldn't do it. So I made these other things, which I'll show you. But anyway, then years later, I was able to, my skills went up. And I started to make these pieces. And they're almost like drawings. It's called Lexicon. So I think of it as almost like the alphabet of a language. Each one is a letter of a language, and it's a language that, its own language. And they're really, I don't have any more slides, but you can see that one in person. And it actually looks a lot bigger. I got so used to looking at the pictures that when I saw it again, I was like, oh, it's bigger than I thought. It's really hard to capture it because it's a pretty big wall, I guess. But they're all folded clay. And some of them are actually thrown at the wall as well. I don't know if you can see any there, but the ones that are more like crinkly looking are pieces of clay that I just threw at the wall, and they stuck, and then I peeled them off. Yeah, and I thought it almost like a diaristic kind of activity where every day I would make one or two, and that's how it went. This is another what are they? These are called Topographic Iterations, and these are, after that kind of formal folding, I was thinking sometimes I like my work to not be so intentional, and so I thought about crumpling as a kind of chaotic form of folding. And these are large pieces of white paper that I crumpled up, photographed them in pieces so that it could be very high resolution, put that back together, printed it on another same, not that same piece of paper, but another exact same flat white piece of paper, printed it out, so then you have a printed version of the crumples, and then I crumpled it again. So, so that has this weird thing where, well, actually these are in the show too, so we can see those. But you'll see that it's very hard to tell the difference between the physical crumples and the illusory crumples, which is kind of interesting just in terms of even that 2D, 3D thing again. This was another instance of me freaking out about drawing when Jidane asked me to do something for their benefit or something like that, and I didn't know what to do. So then I ended up making these sculptures out of their paper. They're folded paper sculptures. And I really ended up kind of liking them. And so then they led to these black folds, which are also in the show, or some of them are in the show. And those are folded aluminum. I felt like paper sculptures are just very hard. After I had that living room and hyperbolic space piece and trying to take care of that, I just said that's enough of that. So I wanted to make it a more permanent material, and these are folded aluminum, just painted black. And I think of these again as like sort of like black space folded up. And I hope to one day make these on a larger scale. I really want to do that. I'm waiting for the person to commission me for that. These are the original folds. These are also in the show. So they're the original folds that I did, and these are porcelain. And they ended up, being, very organic and whatever, floppy. I mean, I like them also, but it wasn't what I had in mind originally, but I still like them. This was the next iteration of those. So somehow I ended up, when I was frustrated, I took some clay and I rolled it around a tube, and then I dropped it on the floor intentionally. I think I love those, what are they? The wrinkles, whatever they're called, folds. And I wanted to create more of them, so I did that, and it actually was kind of amazing. I made a little one, it looked so cool, and I was like, how do I do this? And of course it's actually really hard. It's porcelain, it's very tricky. Anybody who's worked with it knows. These are pretty big. They're like this big or something. But I started out like this big. And then it became this whole project of, how to preserve this moment of this force, which is really interesting unto itself. So there's this like a moment of force when like this happens, the way the clay is, how damp it is, what kind of day it is, how thin it is, how much force I used, all that stuff plays into the way that looks. And so that's like a physical manifestation of what happened. So I love that. Keeping that was a real challenge, and I won't go on. A lot of times I do go on about it in my talk, so I'm not going to go on. But they want to crack because, it's just porcelain has a memory, and so they just want to crack all the time. But, after much practice, I figured out how to do it. These are virtual ones that I made, and again in the computer, dropped a kind of tube in the virtual world, and then I threaded it. These are a bronze version called Laws of Motion, and a foundry had approached me asking if I wanted to work with them, and I said yes. And these are all unique and done in the same way. So make a clay thing, drop it, cast it, pour it. In this case, they're all unique. They're not additions. So they're all really like a, in this case, they really are like a monument to that moment in time, using bronze, which is this like, monumental material. Oh, and one of those, I'm sure you saw it back on the big banner. And they're in the show. Oh, and these are also in the show. So this is a newer iteration. The other ones were called recumbent folds, and these are called recumbent cubes. So these are the same idea, but taking, almost like a traditionally, what's perceived as a minimalist form, like a cube or a rectangle, and dropping it so it becomes more organic, I guess. Then I was interested also in crushing things, just in the same idea, same way I was thinking about like neutron stars and expansion versus compression. So I made this machine to crush cubes. Actually, originally I was going to a junkyard. I made some cubes, and again, it was this idea of like taking this sort of minimalist form and deforming it and changing it through force. So originally I would make the cube and then bring it to a junkyard and have them crush it there. And that was a whole big project to just get somebody to even like cooperate with that. And I did find I found a very good junkyard that would do it. But still, it was a whole big, like I had to cajole them each time and use all my charm and stuff. So then I thought, I better make my own machine, and then I can also control it more. So this is made with car jacks. So there's 4 car jacks, and you pump it up, and it goes up that way. So it sort of crushes upwards. And these are in the show. And I was interested also just in the various materials, like how would copper crush differently than, like this one is, I think that one's carbon steel versus stainless steel. How much time do we have? This is called Object for Reflection. Am I good on time? Am I okay? This is called Object for Reflection. This is made of, this was the piece that was in Bilbao, and they now have it. This is another large-scale, kind of almost woven metal sculpture where the pieces are, actually this is made a lot like the piece that's upstairs right now. There's punch pieces and they're folded around rings. So again, I'm just gonna go a little faster now because I feel like maybe I'm going a little over. It's again thinking about monumental, I'm okay? Thinking about monumental metal sculpture in like a new way, so you can see that it's flexible, responds to gravity, responds to light. Like from that side, it's see-through. And actually, when I showed this, this is not at Bilbao, this is in my gallery in New York, but in Bilbao, we lit it totally differently, and it was really transparent. So it just changes all the time. But again, it's kind of like the material and the gravity cooperate together to create the shape. Now you can see more what it's made of. This is the piece in the show. And this one I was pretty excited about because I've been sort of like dealing with like hanging things for a long time, and I've made things that also stand up, but I wanted to make one of these that wasn't hanging. And I thought about doing the same thing as what I was doing in the drawings, but with this. So where I was talking about dropping a plane through space, I did that, and then instead of trying to kind of like mimic that with hanging, I made the stands fit the fabric shape, if that makes sense. So we froze it, made things, designed things that would like keep it in that place, and that's what you're seeing right now. But this piece is also made, it's made in the same way. It's all put together from like little metal pieces that are folded over rings. And this one I also wanted to have like a kind of dual meaning where, it looks like something maybe floating down, but it also looks like a quilt, like a metal quilt. So that's why it has this sort of patchwork quality. I really wanted to like make that relationship more clear. And you can kind of see here how it's transparent, but you could certainly go look at it upstairs. That's called experimenting gravity. Oh, this is the like baby to what you see outside. So I started making these a number of years ago. First just out of acrylic, and that's about like 5 feet high, 5.5, 6, I don't know. And these are just, again, thinking, I don't even think I've mentioned topology, my interest in topology, about twisting shapes without tearing them or cutting them and like deforming them. So these are just tubes that are sort of deformed, but they're taking what I do in the computer, but making them into like something in 3-dimensional life. So the same thing that makes the string drawing makes this. But I have to do totally different stuff to it, obviously. But anyway, so I made these, and then this was at Storm King. I showed these in various places. You can see they respond to the light like the one outside. Then Stanford University commissioned me to do a big one at the Lee Ka-shing Center for Learning and Knowledge. And they really took a huge leap, I have to say. And, because I had only made the small ones. And they said, okay, go for it and try to make this big one. And so this is the piece. It's called Threefold, and it's the same shape, twisted and folded 3 different ways. And it's still there. And actually here you can really see like the color shifts so much. That's the same piece in front. It's obviously a different lens and all that, but it's just like a different season, I guess, and the color has changed quite a bit. This is one I recently completed at NYU last summer. It's called The Moon's Eyelid. And same idea. This was a hard one just because it's like 50 feet long and it's just all in one piece versus that other one is 2 pieces. Yeah, anyway. This was done vaguely simultaneously to the one outside. And then there's this one. All equations are wave equations. So this is also made, as I was saying, about sort of dropping a plane through space, actually a piece of paper, but it was really more like a plane. But the idea was to take a piece of paper, drop it through space, and have the paper be the inspiration for the sculpture. And that's still true in that the paper is a 2-dimensional plane. And the idea of having a 2-dimensional plane become a 3-dimensional sculpture is pretty interesting, I think. And for a museum, because paper is like kind of the first art material, it like seemed like it made a lot of sense. So I did that dropping plane through space, capturing it in different views, and each part of the sculpture that you see, only 2 parts in this case, they're different views. But what I have to do then is kind of expand out the lines and make them 3-dimensional to create a 3-dimensional sculpture. The other thing is the title, All Equations Are Wave Equations. When I was at Stanford, a physicist said that to me, Peter Graham. I don't remember what we were talking about, but he said, oh, well, everything's a wave. The wave is the heart of physics. And that really has stuck with me just because, sound is a wave, light is a wave, they're gravity waves. I mean, maybe electrons are, in their sense, waving. So everything is sort of moving, waving. And this piece is about light, and obviously light is a wave. What else did I write down? Oh, gravity, of course. It's showing gravity. Also, when we were installing it, I was sort of standing in it at one point, and it really just seemed like I was in a wave, like a water wave. So I thought, well, this is definitely a wave piece. And I thought that that just encompassed all that the sculpture was about, and so that's hence the title. And that's it, actually. Thank you very much.